Hello, everybody. This is Carly Brookfield, Chief Executive of Driving Instructors Association. For those of you who aren't our members, not driver trainers or rider trainers, and don't have a clue who we are, DIA is the largest professional association for driver and rider trainers of all types, every vehicle, every license category in the UK. We're also an advanced testing body known all over the world for the robust standards of our testing via Diamond, and we're a respected road safety expert, particularly in the areas of driver and rider education, and advisor to organisations like Department for Transport and Driving and Vehicle Standards Agency. Which takes me on to the point of today's presentation. And you've got the live me versus the AI me for once, because I thought it was important to dig down into some of the detail of this report and take you through that as you read it yourself, or perhaps don't want to read it, and you can see the highlights in this particular report. Now, I'm sure you've all got DVSA's annual report, which was published this week, on your holiday reading list to take away with you when you get that chance to jet off to somewhere or drive off to somewhere this summer. But for those of you who are not necessarily going to reach for this as your reading materials for your holidays or whilst you relax, I thought it'd be useful to take you through some of the key takeaways and highlights of that report. Now, I've used this very well-known quote from Mark Twain on the cover here, not because I'm suggesting for one moment here there's any lies in this report at all, because it's a government agency report. Why would they do that? And it's very carefully audited and checked before it goes out. However, it is a very well-known report that reflects that want by any large organisation and business to massage figures and massage a presentation in an annual report, so it reflects the best version. And whilst it will often, an annual report, reflect challenges in an organisation, they're often, kind of diminished slightly, so they don't necessarily appear as urgent or as critical as they actually are. Now, I'm not saying again that DVSA has done that here, but there are some things that are necessarily kind of, not played up as much as being a crisis as they actually really are. And there's some missing information in there that doesn't necessarily get reflected and doesn't reflect really what's going on out there, that we should all be potentially, concerned about, or at least frustrated about in some way. So with no more hesitation, let's get into some of the detail here. So one of the big takeaways and what people will really be looking at in this report in terms of performance is, where are we with waiting times for Cat B tests? We know the agency delivers a whole lot more than that, and I'm not going into the MOT side here or other areas of testing per se in this. We may do that in a later piece. However, where our members are predominantly concerned is things like Cat B waiting tests and things like rider trainer tests, which we'll go into in a specific presentation later on with Mark Yaffe, and delivery of things like Part 2 and Part 3 tests as well. Although I absolutely get fleet members will be concerned about other forms of testing like bus and coach and HGV, and so we'll do some analysis later on down the track of their performance there. So let's get back to the core testing that everybody, the media, the government ministers, you, me, and parents, learners, everybody is most concerned about. Where are they with waiting times? Now, obviously, this annual report was produced a few months ago, in terms of when it was first created and when it was signed off. So there's been some more marked improvements in test waiting times across the UK since this report was actually printed. However, we'll deal with the information as it is in the report. Waiting times are still 3 times the target that DVSA wants to reach and should reach for test delivery in the UK. So we're still at 21.5 weeks versus a 7-week target. Oh, how we all remember and dream of those days of a 7-week target. I think we'd all take a 14-week target right now, because that's what we had immediately post-COVID. So you can see how much we've deteriorated, that we've gone from 14 weeks just after lockdown, when you'd think it was at its worst, and we're still at a 21.5 week target now, after successive measures have apparently put in place to actually tackle it. Now, DVSA will say in the report that they've actually delivered 2.169 million practical tests against a target of 1.97 million. So they're overperforming on that target. But the national waiting time has only reduced from 21.9 weeks to 21.5 weeks. So that's not necessarily shifted the dial as much as it needs to. So over the last 3 years, the dial indeed has barely moved, despite 200 extra tests being delivered in the last years in particular. The 7-week deadline in terms of target time that they want to get down to is also shown in the report as having no deliverable date set. So it really removes a meaningful deadline for delivery in terms of a target. Even by DVSA's own estimate, 450 to 500,000 extra tests are still needed to really shift the dial on waiting times. And they have said they will still need another 18 months to clear that backlog. So lockdown ends. We're 5 years on from that. We've had the 7 point plan. We've had ministers rushing out other, deep reaching changes like booking system access being blocked off to the approved driving instructor and supposed professional gatekeeper to a license. But we're still in the same position, honestly, that we're at this 3 times the actual target on terms of test delivery. There's also, interestingly, no regional data in the annual report. Now, as NASP and DIA going to meetings with DVSA, they will sometimes share with us stats on regional data. And I had a one-on-one meeting with DVSA last week where they did intimate that they've seen some successes of the booking system changes already impacting on regional centre numbers, and that they're seeing better delivery at some centres and some regions of the UK. But that's not reflected in this report. So the big question is, why don't you disclose the regional data? If it's started to show a positive trend, maybe you didn't have that data in time for publishing the report, but that's the stuff that, if it really is that positive, I'd expect you to be PRing that, and you're not. So again, that makes the cynic in me question, why is it not in the report, and why are you not saying more about those regional numbers? Prove me wrong and deliver some data on those regional numbers. Another question about the annual report and what it actually delivers in terms of information is that examiner numbers don't add up. We know that the booking system has been an issue in terms of test waiting times and the ability to get a test. But in terms of test delivery and bringing waiting times down, examiner recruitment, retention and deployment is the biggest factor and is the biggest thing that can shift dial in terms of performance. The report initially says that there has been a net increase of approximately 188 driving examiners through their various recruitment campaigns. There's been over 19 recruitment campaigns thus far to recruit new examiners. However, elsewhere it says the active car examiner workforce has reached approximately 1,604 full-time examiners. So on those figures, that should represent a 7% year-on-year increase. However, a 7% increase would appear to be close to 105 full-time, not 188. So we'd like to know, DVSA, whether it's mixing its headcount, full-time trainees and operationally productive examiners together in this mix to arrive at your figures. Basically, how are you doing these figures? And so we've issued a Freedom of Information request for further information on solid examiner numbers. And what I want to know is, how many you got, how many are full-time, how many are part-time, and what are they doing? Are they just doing Cat B flat out predominantly? What time is being spent to catch up on part 2 and 3? And clearly, we won't be surprised at the figures on standards checks. Delivery, as you'll see later, is another concern that we're showing in the report. There's a piece of interesting anecdotal evidence that's clearly not going to be reflected in this report either, that we're being contacted by those who have actually gone through examiner training as far back as March, April this year, and they're telling me they still haven't been deployed. So these are people who've passed the training course. They've successfully completed, they're ready to go, but they're saying they're sat there twiddling their thumbs for over 4 or 5 months now, near a test centre that they expect to be deployed to that's got high waiting times, and they haven't been deployed. Now, when I pressed DVSA on that last week, they did say that information is slightly historical now, and that anecdotal feedback is kind of out of date because they're getting through that backlog of being able to deploy people a lot quicker now. They've got more efficient systems. They are deploying people who've passed the course. However, the emails that I've received are from the last couple of weeks. These are individuals who are telling me they still haven't been deployed. So questions still remain about the efficiency of people who've completed the course being deployed to a test centre to actually help bring those test times down. There's a little bit in that report as well that is, again, it makes you slightly cynical, slightly querying of what you're presenting here, what argument you're making, and whether you're talking out of both sides of your mouth a little bit. The learner readiness narrative that we can see in the report. So patting themselves on the back for things like the Ready to Pass campaign, which I do think the comms team has done a very good job on and is very necessary, regardless of test waiting times issues. It's always a good message about making sure pupils are actually ready to go to the test centre. But some of that narrative could be seen as a deflection from issues that they're causing themselves. So their DVSA is pushing a 50% first-time fail rate and the readiness campaign as potentially positive things. We're kind of slowing down people from rushing to the test centre and the wrong people becoming licensed too quickly. But that's not really what's happened here. It's not you enabling a successful campaign to stop people passing the gateposts who shouldn't be passing the gateposts. It's really your own supply issues that are stopping that from happening. So claiming that as a win, it's slightly uncomfortable with our industry per se. It might fly with other road safety stakeholders who aren't quite as intimately knowledgeable about the process and what's really happening out there, but it doesn't necessarily fly with our sector. A big area of concern that you should have when reading any organisation's annual report is when its financial underperformance is reflected in the manner in which DVSA seems to be going at the moment. Now, it's not unusual for large government agencies and large businesses to be operating such a big net expenditure deficit as DVSA are at the moment. They're at about 86.6 million net expenditure deficit. And things like Premier League football clubs, huge government organisations and multinational businesses can comfortably carry that level of deficit. However, we're not talking about that scenario here. This level of net expenditure versus actual revenue takes them to a net expenditure deficit of over 19%, where normally anything over 10% for an organisation is concerning. The deficit has widened sharply this year, with key drivers being cited by DVSA, such as income did rise by 400 to 437 million, and that's up from 424 million last year. So that income is coming from higher test volumes and more demand for tests, so that the income is rising. However, the expenditure is outstripping that income. So expenditure jumped to 523 million, mainly driven by higher staff costs. Now, obviously, they have to accumulate some of that higher expenditure to get themselves to a position of delivering again. So they're on the back foot. They have to deliver. They're going to have to spend their way out of it, and so they're spending on recruiting more people. So that's going to have a cost, but also trying to retain key people like examiners. So there's been obviously spend on the time limited bonuses, the bonuses for overtime and retention bonuses for examiners, and overtime allowance payments as well. What we'd have liked to seen in this report, and what we will be pressing on, however, is you've spent money on expenditure on overtime and incentive payments, and we agree that's sensible, but is all that fairly short-term spending on bonuses to keep people there for now to get you through the bump really having an impact? What's the analysis behind those figures? And are people, as in those in the examiner's position or would-be examiners, going to be cynical of these short-term measures and think, do I really want to stay here and get these bonuses in the short term versus, lobby for a longer term impact on my paying conditions? It's nice to earn more in the short term, but sustainable earnings, I'd rather see my salary go up. And that again brings us back to the question of why have we not achieved examiner pay increases as a sustainable pay increase rather than these short term bonuses? Because that is what will attract more people to the job and keep more people into the job in longer term. DVSA points to one of the issues that they have with expenditure and income, not gelling together very well at the moment. The fact that fees have been frozen for the past 15 years, they haven't put fees up, and that's a structural driver for some of the financial underperformance issues. It has been noted in the annual report, though, that the Treasury is going to approve a consultation on amending some of its fees. So fees are likely to go up, folks. So that's now under active review with DfT and the Treasury. So expect fee increases to come as a result of that review. And they're going to land on the customer. They're going to land on the business-to-business customers, the instructors and the organisations like us that pay accreditation fees. I think we're the only ADI association that actually pays DVSA anything, and for our accreditation of our advanced tests. So those kind of fees will probably go up. And pupil fees will potentially go up as well. Now, in the bucket of pupil fees going up, there is a strong argument that those should go up anyway, because if we increase theory test and practical test fees, it means a service that needs to be provided is adequately being paid for and sustainable, but more importantly, it means people are more likely to value something they're paying a bit more at, and they're more likely to think about their investment in that or return on investment rather than seeing the theory test and the practical test as a have a go throwaway item. So I think the industry would support fee increases for test fees, but when the fee lands on the driving instructor and their fees, maybe not so much. Although arguably the ADI license fee is not one of the most expensive professional licenses that you can pay for, one big question that doesn't come out in this report, but it's going to come out now in terms of some information that we've acquired through a Freedom of Information request is, are you actually getting value for money for that license fee you pay already? And if it goes up, it's going to put more pressure on the value for money question. So whilst fees haven't gone up for 15 years, whilst income is slightly up, but expenditures outstripping it, one area where fee income has gone up, but arguably, expenditure has gone down because service delivery has gone down. They just aren't delivering the services here, is ADI and PDI fee income. So the report doesn't detail this, but we put a Freedom of Information request in for this information specifically. And I asked the agency for a breakdown of total revenue derived from approved driving instructors and PDIs on an annual basis. And this request returned the information that over the last 5 years, DVSA's income from ADIs and PDIs has risen from about 7.5 million to over 10 million pounds a year. So fee income from ADIs and PDIs has risen by a third, and mainly probably attributable to the explosion of PDI applications. So there's more people paying for a PDI license and for part 2 and 3 tests. That all would be great if people thought they were getting, something back for that fee. You are getting something back, obviously, because you're getting a license to practice and a license to go out there and earn income yourself. So that argument about that value, I think we all get. But in terms of, is that license fee also paying for services like your tests, your standards checks, your part 2s and your 3s, and the level of support service DVSA, and are you getting that? I think the resounding answer would be no at the moment. And that no is coming out in the satisfaction score. So DVSA has certain targets and certain measures that it wants us to reach, and you'll see those, kind of reflected in red and green in the report, whether they're meeting them or missing them. And the trainer satisfaction score is at 42% at the moment, and that's down from 47% last year, and it's versus a target of 60%. And this key performance indicator has been moving backwards over the last few years, unsurprisingly, with the problems around service delivery. The candidate satisfaction score is moving up slightly because as people feel like they're starting to get through the backlog and accessibility tests is improving, and maybe they're also believing a little bit of the spin out there that DVSA are getting on top of the booking system issues, and they're starting to see that. Candidate satisfaction is starting to improve slightly. However, candidates are pretty naive. The wider public is pretty naive about all the other underlying delivery problems because they don't see it because it doesn't hurt them necessarily. Or it won't hurt them until much later in the chain in terms of the quality of trainers and the quality of their input and availability of a good ADI or PDI as well. So we know that delivery of ADI and PDI services has deteriorated, even though their fee income is going up from these. As they're getting more people into the industry, they actually can't cope with these more people coming in. They can't deliver to the more people that they're allowing into the industry. So we're seeing a continuing backlog of part 2 and 3 tests, which is obviously very concerning to ADI trainers, training organisations, and to PDIs themselves. What's another worrying factor that the public and the media don't know what they don't know to be worried about is that we've got a quality deficit issue potentially and a standards deficit issue because we're not monitoring standards at the moment, realistically. There's less than 700 standards checks being delivered each year, and that's clearly deteriorated since lockdown. So when standards checks were actually introduced, there was over 12,000 checks a year actually occurring. And immediately pre-COVID, there was around 10,500 to 11,000 checks being done. Now we're down to less than 700 a year, and we're only seeing the most at-risk people. So those people who flag up on the tip report or from other areas of concerns like complaints, those people are the only ones having interventions. Now, it's good that we're having interventions for risky instructors, but we only know who's risky from the metrics that we've got. And the tip report is not a completely reliable picture of what's happening out there with standards because the metrics aren't perfect. We can't get metrics on every test and every ADI's test because of that problem that it's not mandatory information that's fed into the tip report. It will depend on somebody turning up to the test centre with a badge in their window that's clear and being able to link that ADI to that pupil and their performance on test. And we know that some people are taking their badges out, particularly if they're taking pupils that they've never trained and they're just taking to test centre. So the science is not perfect behind this to know who you should be seeing and who you should be worried about. So we're not doing volume standards checks of people. We're not surveying and monitoring and pulling up performance where we should be across the board. So that obviously is a concern in terms of quality and standards within the sector. And actually, some of us feel that, we want to be assessed in our role. We want to get feedback. We want our performance to be evaluated. So it's not just a great, we're getting away, we're not having a standards check. The poor performers will think like that. They'll think it's great that they potentially haven't been seen now for a cycle of 7 or 8 years. But the good performers, they will want other people to be standards checked and they will want a standards check themselves because they want to have their performance independently evaluated. There's also the issue financially that all in the detail of the finances there, you'll see some other information about cancellation costs and the expenditure on cancellation costs. So obviously cancellations are a big problem with instructor, with examiner sickness, no shows and all of those kind of things that can cause problems in that kind of expenditure. So DVSA over the last year has paid out over, well, nearly 700,000 in cancellation costs to pupils for late notice cancellation where they've had to move a test at last minute. That compensation, however, only goes to the candidate. Instructors absorb the cost of a disrupted lesson slot, having to take that person there and then find out that it's been cancelled. They're operating their own business on very lean margins, and they've got to absorb that cost and that waste of time. They do not get compensated for that cancellation cost. So we know that pupils are being paid out, they're getting their money back, but instructors aren't. So in the whole, go figure, you get a 47% satisfaction rate. You're lucky it's not even lower in my estimation. Another area for ADIs and the agency to be concerned about potentially is that the ADI pipeline is under strain. There is a very healthy register at the moment, but is that healthy that we've got so many people there? The register is now over 44,000 qualified ADIs and around about 5,500 trainees in the process. Those are the people that they know about in terms of they have a trainee license or they know are out there because they're looking at the part 1, 2, and 3 data, as in who's coming for a part 2 and 3 test, who isn't necessarily on a trainee license. Again, the data is not great there, and there should be more pressure on organisations like DVSA to do better in terms of the metrics they have. They're a very data poor organisation in terms of how they collect data, what data is available, and how they act on that. I know that they've got recruitment campaigns going on at the moment for more data roles and digital data roles. So get to and increasing their readiness and their preparedness across the organisation and their efficiency in gathering data and how they use that data as well. But they're not there yet. So knowing who's actually acting as a trainee instructor out there and what they look like and what their quality look like and how they're going in that process and how they're being supported or not and what their trainings look like is quite fraught because you've got this dual system still that allows some people to just go and put themselves into tests and potentially legitimately, illegitimately apply their trade as a trainee instructor. And then you've got people that you can survey, you can monitor, you can evaluate, and you can, impose certain conditions on their conduct and their delivery under the trainee system. We shouldn't have this group over here that you don't really have a handle on how many and what they're doing. So that would be one big reason to try and get a better handle on that by only having one route to be a trainee. And there's 20,000 new applications occurring on average a year at the moment. So the run rate for applications to become a PDI is around 1,700 applications a month. Now, that does not translate to people who will enter the industry for one reason or the other. They'll fall off that journey. However, that's still a lot of people starting the journey. And that results in a lot of resource issues for DVSA, and they've had to recruit more human beings to deal with those applicants than some of us would argue they should be. In the age of modern recruitment, should we be having human beings just dealing with PDI applications? They should be modernising that side of things in a way that those of us who've worked in mass volume recruitment positions in other industries started to do quite a while ago before even the advent of AI. But they've had to recruit human beings there rather than put them on the front line doing examining just to deal with this explosion of PDI applications. And therein again lies a problem that maybe needs to be fixed. There is a requirement of DVSA to allow people who meet the requirements to enter the industry and start training. But does that criteria need to get more robust? Is it a good thing to be allowing so many people in if we can't do more about getting them through the system and training them within a reasonable timescale and testing them within a reasonable timescale. We can't necessarily, or they can't as an agency, support them in the way that they really should be supported in this journey. We've got big queries over the quality of training and the training process and the curriculum for that, the lack of a consistent curriculum for that. Should we be allowing more and more people into a system that is fundamentally flawed? Especially if it's also causing resource issues for an agency that already has massive resource issues. And another argument for controlling PDI numbers in a more positive and productive way is that if we are allowing so many people into the industry, we've got such a big register as we have of qualified ADIs at the moment, will demand sustain that in the future? Are we sending people on a hiding to nothing? Have we got a rising competitive scenario occurring in the market where we're oversupplying potentially against demand? Because whilst demand is peak at the moment, and I know a lot of you are feeling that, juggling your pipeline of new people who want to start training with those that you're trying to get through tests, plus you might be an ADI trainer on top of that, trying to deal with getting your candidates for part 2 and 3 through. There is still this story that is emerging that demand is going down, and it's likely to go down if you look at demand curves historically. Are we letting more people in than the industry can sustain? And for you as individuals and training businesses, that's a consideration for the future. If we're going to have more and more people in the industry, more competition, how do I stay ahead of that competition, either by my positioning and my standing and how I market myself, but also in terms of what I offer? Do I have to look at diversifying what I offer? Because the learner market, for example, will become so saturated because it's the go-to market for a PDI. And do I diversify as an experienced ADI to make sure that when that demand drops, I'm playing across more markets where demand might actually be more consistent? So there we go. So those are some of the figures there from the overall annual report to reflect upon as you head into the summer break, and may consider that annual report as some of your summer reading material, or just generally picking up a copy of it and having a look, which you all should, because it reflects the performance of the agency that you are paying a fee to, and your pupils are paying a fee to, and you're all reliant on services of. Obviously, we're going to be taking some of the queries we've derived from looking at the report, and some of the queries that members have already sent us, and fielding these to the ministers and to DVSA themselves. I'm sure they're not happy with the underperformance in here as well. And particularly the financial aspects, as well as the actual physical delivery problems the agency have got. The financial aspects, for anybody who's obviously knowledgeable about the financial operations of a business, are very concerning. And those are going to be questions that we've got around the capability of DVSA to deal with those issues into the future, and what are they going to do to reverse the trends that they're seeing there financially at the moment. But that's it for now, folks. I think I've given you more than enough of my usual waffle through here. That's the benefit of AI me. She doesn't talk as much as real me does, but I hope you found that useful. As I said, if you've got any questions or queries about this annual report that you want to field to us, to then on field to DVSA and the wider ministers, please let us have those by emailing. Probably the best two emails: help@driving.org, or you can email them directly to me. My email address is on the website too. And we'll ask those questions for you. But in the meantime, happy reading of the report. And I hope you stay safe out there, and hope to catch up with you all soon. Take care, folks. Bye bye.